Good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. I'm here to discuss the results of our office's investigation into the shooting of Mr. Salaythis Melvin by Corporal James Montiel. On August 7th, 2020, just a few short months after George Floyd was murdered by law enforcement in Minneapolis, an unprecedented outcry about police violence, abuse, and racism that still reverberates this and other communities across the country was prompted. Salaythis Melvin was shot and killed by an Orange County Sheriff's Office corporal in the parking lot of the Florida Mall. Preliminary media coverage told us Mr. Melvin was not the target of the police investigation. We also learned that Mr. Melvin was fleeing from the officers and was shot in the back, a fact that seemed to discredit any suggestion that Mr. Melvin posed a threat to the police. This incident shocked me. It shocked our community. Grief and anger exploded, and people took to the streets to protest. As a then candidate for state attorney, based on the information that was publicly available, I believed that this case would ultimately be prosecuted by my office if I were elected. Although this incident happened in August of 2020, no review took place prior to my taking office in January 2021. One of my first priorities upon taking office was to implement a policy for officer-involved shootings that would ultimately govern the investigation of this case. I appreciate the community's patience while we conducted an extensive review of this incident. From January through March, we spent time developing our officer-involved critical incident policy. On April 9th of 2021, my team interviewed Uriel Ortiz and Scott Dozier. On April 27th, I and my team met with the family of Mr. Salaythis Melvin and their attorneys. On April 30th, there was an interview that was conducted of Detective Latasha Davila. On that same day, there was also an interview of Master Deputy Rodney Nelson. On May 7th, we obtained Montiel body-worn camera assignment information confirming that he had not been issued a body-worn camera at the time of the incident. On May 4th, we made a request to the Orange County Sheriff's Office for their use of force expert. On May 20th, we made a request to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for their use of force expert. On May 25th, body-worn camera submitted for video enhancement. On May 28th, we researched so that we could find our own independent experts on police use of force. On June 21st, the video enhancement of the body-worn camera was found to not be possible based on the pixelation of the videos of that camera. On August the 4th, Dr. Hugh provided his expert report. On August 16th, we interviewed Miguel Ponce. On August 17th, we received a response to subpoenas from Simon Malls. On August the 20th, we interviewed Jason Palmier. On August the 30th, we received the Florida Department of Law Enforcement use of force training curriculum and began to review it. On October 13th, we interviewed Deputy Miller. We also interviewed Corporal Bullock. On October 19th, Orange County Sheriff's Office provided their use of force PowerPoint, training PowerPoint. On October the 21st, Jason Palmore provided a response to a subpoena. On November 18th, the State Attorney's Office received additional training materials. And on January 10th, the State Attorney's Office received the final report from expert Steph Stoughton. In keeping with my promise of police accountability, it was important to me that this case be handled in the way that our office would handle any homicide case. Because it was not presented with charges the way a normal homicide would be, my team worked diligently to gather all the information to determine if the shooting of Salaythis Melvin was lawful. Our office not only reviewed all of the information obtained from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement about this incident, we also performed an independent investigation of what occurred, pursuing every avenue to obtain additional information, video evidence, or witness testimony about what transpired that day. We've spent the last year painstakingly evaluating all the information we uncovered and consulted with experts to reach the right conclusion in this case. The facts of this case are as follows. The evidence shows that several police officers descended upon Mr. Melvin and his 3 companions as they were leaving Dick's Sporting Goods in the Florida Mall. The police sought to arrest Vanshawn Sands, one of Melvin's companions, on a warrant unrelated to his presence at the mall. After the officers confronted Mr. Sands, Mr. Melvin and their 2 other companions, Mr. Bennett and Miss Jones, the officers quickly apprehended Sands, Bennett, and Jones. Mr. Melvin, however, fled away from Dick's Sporting Goods. Although Mr. Melvin was not the target of this police operation, Corporal Montiel's pursuit of Mr. Melvin was legal. Florida law clearly permits officers to detain any companion of a person who is subject to a lawful police investigation and arrest. Mr. Melvin's flight and repeated refusal to cooperate with orders to stop, coupled with his open possession of a firearm, further reinforced Corporal Montiel's legal basis to apprehend him. Mr. Melvin ran directly towards Corporal Montiel, who was seated in an unmarked police car, providing backup to his fellow deputies. Although his car was unmarked, Corporal Montiel was dressed in an Orange County Sheriff's Office tactical vest with the word sheriff and a 5-point sheriff star clearly displayed on the front. Corporal Montiel stated that while Mr. Melvin was running, Mr. Melvin had his hand on a tan firearm that was tucked into the waistband of his pants. According to Corporal Montiel's sworn statement, when Mr. Melvin made eye contact with him, Mr. Melvin changed course, turning 90 degrees and running away from Corporal Montiel and his car. Corporal Montiel got out of his car, drew his firearm, and ordered Mr. Melvin to drop his gun. Mr. Melvin did not comply, and Corporal Montiel began to chase him on foot. Corporal Montiel was not wearing a body-worn camera. However, footage from another deputy's body-worn camera confirms many of these facts. Although the video from the camera is low quality and very grainy, it does show that Mr. Melvin and Corporal Montiel's progress through the parking lot supports the description of these events that Corporal Montiel provided. Corporal Montiel testified that during the chase that followed, Mr. Melvin slowed and looked back at him while keeping his hand on his gun. Corporal Montiel stated that he was in fear that Mr. Melvin was preparing to shoot at him. In response, Corporal Montiel fired 2 shots. One struck Mr. Melvin in the back. No other witnesses saw this portion of the interaction between Corporal Montiel and Mr. Melvin. Neither could the footage from the body-worn camera confirm or refute Corporal Montiel's testimony that Mr. Melvin turned towards him immediately before the shooting, because the image of Mr. Melvin was blocked by a vehicle in the parking lot at that point. However, the body-worn camera footage does show Corporal Montiel firing at Mr. Melvin, and it also shows an object falling from Mr. Melvin's hand after he was shot as he fell to the ground. When officers approached Mr. Melvin, they discovered that the fallen object was a tan-loaded Glock 19 handgun. Therefore, this video evidence demonstrates that by the time he was shot, Mr. Melvin not only had a gun, but had also removed the gun from his waistband and was holding it in his hand. In order to prove that Corporal Montiel committed the offense of murder or manslaughter, our office must affirmatively prove not only that Corporal Montiel fired his gun and fatally wounded Mr. Melvin, but also that his actions were not lawful. Under Florida law, an officer who is engaged in the lawful execution of his duties is justified in using deadly force if he or she reasonably believes that using that force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or another. According to Corporal Montiel, he believed his life was in danger as Mr. Melvin turned back towards him while holding a gun. There is no evidence to refute that belief. Thus, our burden at trial would be to prove that this belief was not reasonable for an officer in his situation. In order to assist us in answering this question, we consulted with two respected experts on police use of force cases to evaluate this case. Professor Seth Stoughton, the expert who also testified for the state of Minnesota during Derek Chauvin's trial for the murder of George Floyd, and Dr. Richard Ho. Both experts reviewed all of the evidence, helped to establish a reliable timeline of the events, identified the factors that influenced their conclusions about the reasonableness of Corporal Montiel's actions, and also discussed key information that was either missing or that could not be known. Both experts agreed that given the totality of the evidence in this case, it was reasonable for Corporal Montiel to conclude that Mr. Melvin posed an imminent and serious risk to the life and safety of himself, his fellow officers, and the public. Accordingly, after this in-depth analysis of the evidence, we have concluded that we cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Corporal Montiel committed a crime in this case. My deepest sympathies go out to Salaythis Melvin's family. I know this is not the result that they've been looking for, and that they feel that they have been denied justice. I also want to be clear that this is a legal decision and not a moral one. I believe that there are many different actions Corporal Montiel could have taken that day that could have resulted in Salaythis Melvin being alive today. There are many points in this sequence of events where all the parties could have taken different actions, and this situation could have had a different outcome. After the murder of George Floyd, many members of our community have expressed anger and frustration at the death of yet another black man at the hands of law enforcement right here in our community. As a black woman who is the mother of black sons, I understand that anger and I understand that frustration. While this case is not George Floyd, the conversation surrounding the overwhelming number of black and brown people whose encounters with law enforcement end in death does not begin or end with this case. When a decision is made to end someone's life, that decision must be treated with the gravity that it deserves. Extensive research on police-involved shootings shows that just about everyone carries this subconscious prejudice known as implicit bias, no matter how well-meaning they might be. In the criminal justice system, this implicit bias may contribute to the many racial disparities in law enforcement. When it comes to police officers, implicit bias is a widespread concern precisely because of how devastating its effects can be. There are certainly many law enforcement officials who understand how devastating the effects of implicit bias can be, and I am proud to work alongside many of them in my role as state attorney. But no one understands this more than the people living in communities where racial minorities are disproportionately targeted by police and arrested. This isn't about any individual incident. It's about the overall system that makes such deaths at the hands of the police disproportionately common. Community policing goes both ways. Just as police perceptions towards the community change, so do community perceptions towards police. It is beyond time we end the failed policies of the past, reckon with these unjust practices that are drastically impacting emerging adults of color, and implement policies and practices that are based on evidence and what studies have shown will work. The unrest in response to police killings shows that we have reached a boiling point. The community is saying enough is enough. Failure to heed calls for reform to the way policing is done in America has resulted in the continued loss of human life, weakened families and communities, and an overwhelming feeling of anger and hopelessness in communities of color. This is a conversation that must be continued nationally until change is made. While the decision not to prosecute this case has been made, my commitment to justice and accountability does not end here. This decision fully represents my commitment to seek the truth in every circumstance, no matter who is the accused. I have established a unit that is focused on public accountability. This unit is led by my Deputy Chief, Alfredo Zamora, and they are responsible for the review of officer-involved shooting cases. We have implemented a policy surrounding the investigation and review of officer-involved shootings. A member of our office responds to the scene of any officer-involved shooting and witnesses the initial investigation. We will continue to work with law enforcement to improve the way we both investigate these cases and support victims every day. We have made recommendations for changes to investigative practices in officer-involved shootings to the Sheriff's Office, Orlando Police Department, and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. We are hopeful to gain their collaboration on these changes. We hope these changes increase the community's trust that we take these cases seriously, we do everything we can to protect against bias, and are committed to thoroughly investigating these cases. We continue to be committed to accountability for officers who violate the law. Meaningful accountability means prioritizing the investigation of these cases, filing charges where an officer has committed a crime, and pushing for meaningful change with our law enforcement partners and our local government. My heart breaks for Mr. Melvin, his family, and this community. I know that many in this community will be disappointed by this decision. However, the community elected me to ensure that there would be a fair and unbiased review of cases involving police accountability. An unbiased review doesn't mean that it must end in prosecution. You entrusted me to review the cases that you could not depend on others to review. That is what we did in this and every case. I know that these steps bring no comfort to Mr. Melvin's family and loved ones whose loss is unbearable and still raw. At this time, these are the only legal actions that I can take. I stand before you with a heavy heart, more committed than ever to bringing positive and meaningful change to our community.